On January 23, 1989, Clarence Norris, the last surviving Scottsboro boy, died at age 76. Throughout his life, he had been sentenced to death 3 times for being falsely accused of raping 2 women, yet he escaped the death penalty and passed away due to Alzheimer's disease. His case, along with Haywood Patterson's and the other Scottsboro boys, had long-lasting effects on the American people. In the early spring of 1931, Clarence Norris, Haywood Patterson, and 7 other African-American men and boys who later became known as the Scottsboro Boys were accused of rape and sentenced to death. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, known as the NAACP, and the International Labor Defense, the legal wing of the Communist Party, came to their aid and provided them with vital support. Through demonstrations, rallies, parades, speeches, and flyers, the NAACP and the ILD raised public awareness about the intersection of race and the legal system. The persistent communication caused by their campaigns during the 1930s was a relevant component in developing the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The American Great Depression started in August 1929 and devastated the nation. The collapsing economy left 250,000 young people hopping the train from city to city to look for work. Workers were at risk for injury, exposure to the elements, starvation, and even death. Freight hopping was even more hazardous if someone was black because racism and territoriality moved on the rails with the population. Even so, the Great Depression forced many people into this way of life, including the Scottsboro Boys. These young men, ranging in age from 12 to 19, came from low-income families, and all of them had dropped out of school at some point before 6th grade to work and help their families survive. They were frequent freight hoppers at the time of their arrest. On March 25, 1931, one of these freight trains was on a route through Jackson County where Scottsboro was located. An altercation broke out on the train between some white teenagers and the group who ultimately became the Scottsboro Boys. After getting off the train in Paint Rock, Alabama near Scottsboro, the white boys reported the Scottsboro Boys for assault and the sheriff arrested them. On the run from their own charges of vagrancy and solicitation, Victoria Price and Ruby Bates, 2 known sex workers also on the train, accused them of rape, which was punishable by the death sentence and deflected attention away from the girls' charges. The incident caused shock in the community, and people wanted the Scottsboro Boys to be lynched. In the 1930s, lynching was common in the South, particularly when black men were accused of harming white women. Lynchings became more common at times and places where white people felt the most vulnerable, such as during the Great Depression.
A lot of people surrounding those boys, many of them having guns, of course, and ropes or pieces of rope. They were intent on mayhem.
After their arrest, proceedings moved very quickly for the Scottsboro Boys, and their initial trial took place only 12 days later on April 6, 1931. The trial took place before an all-white, all-male jury who sentenced 8 out of the 9 Scottsboro Boys to death. Soon after the first set of trials, the International Labor Defense, or the ILD, convinced the young men to sign an affidavit accepting their help. Since the Communist Party's image relied heavily on advocating for civil rights, the ILD offered to provide defense attorneys. The Scottsboro Boys readily accepted because the state did not provide them with competent public defenders, and the case was handed over to the Communist Party. The ILD held rallies, gave speeches, and led parades and demonstrations all over the country in support of the Scottsboro Boys. This mass communication with the American people caused public action, with thousands of letters flooding in from all around the country from people who believed in the boys' innocence. The letters made it clear to the Alabama courts that America's watchful eye was on them. Ultimately, Alabama postponed the execution to give time for an appeal. Around the time of the first trial, the NAACP, who had made a practice of defending unjustly accused African Americans, reached out to the Scottsboro Boys and urged the young men not to sign an agreement with the ILD. They were worried that the idea of the Communist Party would turn the public away, since communism was highly controversial. The NAACP held protests and demonstrations in support of the boys. After battling publicly with the ILD over the trials and representation, the NAACP withdrew from the case. However, America noticed the controversy, and there was a better understanding of the racial inequities taking place within the legal system. After the first round of trials and the stay of execution, Powell v. Alabama, the first case before the United States Supreme Court, began in November of 1932. The Supreme Court ruled that Alabama had denied the Scottsboro Boys the right to legal counsel and violated their right to due process outlined in the 14th Amendment.
The court made it very clear that in capital cases, the defendant not only has a right to counsel, but if they don't have one of their own, the court has to provide them a competent lawyer to represent them.
The Supreme Court overturned all of the convictions and ordered a second set of trials for the boys in the local Alabama courts. The prosecution's case weakened throughout the trial process because, at these trials, a surprising witness testified for the defense. Ruby Bates, one of the original accusers, recanted her earlier testimony and became the star witness. However, even after Bates changed her story, Haywood Patterson and Clarence Norris were again sentenced to death by another all-white jury. This verdict demonstrated how juries were willing to overlook evidence to convict innocent people solely relying on race. In January 1935, the cases were overturned again by the United States Supreme Court in Norris v. Alabama. This time, the court ruled that Alabama denied the Scottsboro boys a fair trial because of the biased jury and suggested that lower courts review the case again. After more trials, it took many years for the Scottsboro boys to be set free. In the years after the trials, people realized how significant an impact the Scottsboro boys case had had on communities of color. The immense reaction caused by the ILD and the NAACP's public campaigns helped people understand the ties between race and the law. The Scottsboro boys case changed how the legal system handled legal representation and was the foundation for a more equitable jury selection process. Those initial courtroom inequities later became a monumental controversy of the 1960s civil rights movement. However, it was not until the 1986 case of Batson v. Kentucky that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled prosecutors cannot legally decline prospective jurors because of race. Because of the Scottsboro boys, jury selection has transformed from a system leading to all-white, all-male juries into one including people of all races, genders, sexual orientations, and abilities. While the Batson v. Kentucky and Scottsboro cases were great strides forward for our legal system, jury selection is still a prominent issue in today's society. According to a Washington Post survey of death penalty cases going back to the 1970s, prosecutors continued to strike black jurors.
Even when a jury, for example, in the South in a death penalty case isn't all white, it is typically predominantly so.
Though much progress has been made, it is essential to use the Scottsboro boys case as an example of failure in the legal procedures. Their trials highlighted the inequities in the legal system between different races. With the public attention focused on these inequities, a foundation was laid to approve better legal representation to people of color. To a large extent, the Scottsboro case was a defining moment in the American legal system's history. One person who was affected heavily by the case was Shelia Washington, an African-American public relations manager for a Republican governor in the 80s and 90s. She had read a book on the case early in her life and decided to get their case heard in 2004. She opened a museum in Scottsboro near the site where the boys got arrested and displayed exhibits on their lives and the trials. According to the Washington Post, quote, "She won something few thought possible, posthumous pardons for the defendants in 2013, but also full exonerations for the history books," unquote. Through unrelenting communication with leaders in Scottsboro, Washington managed to memorialize the Scottsboro boys' legacies. The Scottsboro boys case created an uproar during the 1930s, which fueled the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The case influences courts, juries, judges, and civilians to this day. The public awareness about the Scottsboro trials caused by the NAACP and the ILD was critical in advocacy for change in the 1930s. The protests around the country were inspired by those organizations taking to the national news and fighting for justice for the Scottsboro boys. This mass communication through flyers, newspapers, interviews, and demonstrations is similar to what we have today. The most substantial advancement in communication from the 1930s is that today, everyone can have a voice and speak up on various platforms about topics important to our communities.
And but what makes social media unique for what we had so far is we all at the basic technological level the same.
People take to social media and other media to talk about their beliefs and opinions on current events worldwide. As we continue to advocate for equality in the legal system, Americans can use the legacy of Clarence Norris and the other Scottsboro boys as an example of how telling a story can fuel a social movement for change.